Right, let's start another video. Now, when we think of the Civil War, you have the Union and the Confederacy. This is, of course, the American Civil War. Other countries had their own. As a matter of fact, the British had several. Because, of course, they did. But for the United States, this war, some 80 years following its creation, was by far one of the most influential events in its history. Now, there's a big idea that goes around with the Civil War. And that's essentially that the whole war was a lost cause, that the Confederacy had no chance of winning, and that basically its fall was inevitable. This could be from the perspective of either a Southern defender basically arguing, hey, we were against lost odds and yet we still fought our best, or a Northern supremacist essentially asserting they were doomed anyways because we were better. Now, was the North better than the South in several metrics? 100% yes. Just manpower and industry alone would indicate that. That said, the war was not a lost cause. Let's consider a few facts. One, when it comes down to the borders, I'm not going to be very good at drawing them. That's number one. But also, when you think of the potential areas the Confederacy could claim, you have from Texas to Delaware. Basically, think of all the slave states in the Union that were not on their way to abolish slavery as lands that could be claimed by the Confederacy. Along with that, you have several territories out west that were also claimed. But let's focus mainly on the areas that weren't, because they were the ones that played the biggest role. And importantly, with the border states, who would be Missouri, Kentucky, admittedly my drawings are very poor, Maryland, and Delaware, one thing is clear. The South had several territories that it could take theoretically, but that wasn't its main goal. The point of noting these areas is there was a mix of loyalists and secessionists in the regions, meaning the South would have better chances of securing those regions. But let's also think about other factors. The capital of the United States was right across from the Confederacy. In fact, if you stood at the banks of D.C., you could see the house of several Southern leaders, or at least one. And you could see Virginia. Like, Virginia was right in the North's backyard. Simultaneously, one of the most crucial ports in the entire Union, New Orleans, or New Orleans, was right here in the Confederacy, right far away from the front lines. This is, of course, ignoring the sea, but in terms of land power, the Confederacy was far more secure than the Union in terms of strategic locations. Not to mention, Alabama, where the Confederacy first had its coronation of Jefferson Davis and was the first functional capital, specifically Mobile, Alabama, trying to remember the exact name, that is down here. I forgot the exact location, but Mobile is down in the deep south, whereas the capital of the Union is right there. Richmond, too, somewhere in this area, generally speaking. And you can see, still, it's farther behind the lines than the Union's. Literally, D.C. is right across the border. So, not only is this a massive advantage, the key political centers of the Confederacy are farther away, they also had the Mississippi River, which runs here, more or less, and they had the territories of Texas, Florida, Virginia, and several other key states. This means that while their population was certainly less than the population centers of Illinois, Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, and the like, they still had decent populations they could draw from, and if all else failed, they could pull a Seminole and retreat to barely developed regions in, say, Florida or Georgia and wage a guerrilla war, for he can't speak apparently, to basically annoy the Federalists until they wanted to leave. And another key advantage, importantly, was the South had to defend. That's all they really needed to do. Defense is far easier than assault and less costly. On the other hand, assault is what the Union needed to do because their initial war aim was to crush the Confederacy from leaving the Union. The South, in both of its beliefs, defending slavery and defending its independence and sovereignty, just needed to defend. The North had to assault the Confederacy. They had to take aggressive actions during the war because that is the only way to achieve their war ends. And so, naturally, that plays heavily to the Confederacy's advantage, especially as the war goes on and you're calling out more and more and more soldiers. The advantage of being on the defensive gets even better, especially because by the end of the war, there were Gatling guns. Were they used all that often? No, in fact, they were barely, if ever, used. But that does mean that as the war goes on, eventually the North could well tire itself out. But here's the important thing. In order for the Confederacy to win, it needs the North to get tuckered out quickly. That may sound weird, because while the South has the option of long-term defense, its strategy would logically rely on it, right? No. At least it shouldn't, because as people do mention, the North has more industry. The North has more manpower. So while the war must function defensively for the South, aggressive action is still required because if they don't take any action, the North can essentially just use attrition to wear them out. Even as defense is easier to hold, it is not... Forgive me. Even while defense is easier on manpower and resources, the North has so much more that they could 100% just human wave tactics rush the Confederacy and still win. Would it be advisable? No. Would it be what Grant and Sherman would later do? No. They would do a lot of tactics that would expend men to get results, but even then, that's one part of war, and two, they still used them strategically, and in battle, used proper tactics. Even if the South had better generals for tactics, the fact is that the Union had more men, just flat out. They had more equipment. And so the South had to plan around that. And could they win? Yes. The United States won against the United Kingdom, well, specifically England. I don't know if the Acts of Union had been done by the time of independence. Distinctly possible. Probably, honestly. But the United Kingdom and all of its territories could have overwhelmed the United States, but it still had a chance of winning should it play its cards right. It's the same with the Civil War. In fact, arguably even more so because the United States has its executive elected every 4 years. That's the dude negotiating for treaties. That also means if he goes to a defeatist or otherwise enemy camp to the war, good chance the Confederacy can just negotiate out of it, and by the time the commander-in-chief isn't interested in a war, well, the war's basically over, because what are the generals going to do? Their boss is saying we're done. And so the South could easily win. And that is where I would argue it isn't a lost cause, because the South just had to hold out. The North had to succeed. If it continued receiving defeat after defeat strategically, keyword there, strategically, it would be unlikely to be willing to surrender. But if it could hold on, it could wear down the Confederacy enough to win. Essentially, both have the wolf by the ears. The Confederacy is defensive in terms of its strategies, but needs to go on the offensive in order to effectively win, because the North, yes, its job is assault, but if they just defend early on and build up their troops, that'll allow them to achieve their goals far easier. And so that's the situation both find themselves in. And what I would honestly suggest, if we're just wargaming this, like assuming everything goes properly, yeah, an immediate push to DC would be best. The reason why is quite simple. As stated, the North could not sustain a long campaign if morale wasn't with them. As we see, even in our own timeline, when the North was doing pretty well, all things considered, I mean, they were pushing back the Confederacy in several fronts throughout the war. In fact, they took several fortifications along the sea, and even took New Orleans pretty early on. Even during that time, there was still some level of just general apathy and dislike of the war, especially for people who didn't really care for the blacks that much, because, well, guess what? When Lincoln made the Emancipation Proclamation and people took it as an end to slavery, which it wasn't, by the way, but when they took it as such, they decided to abandon their soldiers. They deserted. There were draft riots. People didn't want to fight. And so, enough morale victories and the North could very well fall apart. If DC was taken early, well then guess what? What are you going to argue with as Lincoln if the war continues on? Sure, it's technically a defensive war because the Confederacy are the guys who fired the first shots. But when they made their attack, you couldn't hold the line. If you can't hold the line, why should we trust you as Commander-in-Chief? Why should we vote you back into office when time comes again? And let's face it, if DC is captured, good chance a lot of the government's going down with it. Because unless you get everyone out of DC and establish a temporary capital, say in Philadelphia, there's a good likelihood that several important politicians are going to be captured, and that's a lot of leverage that the Confederacy now has. Furthermore, it would galvanize southern states in the border areas, like Kentucky, like Missouri, Delaware, Maryland, to want to join the Confederacy because it looks like a surefire win. If you take out your opponent's capital, especially a capital with the government still in it, and you have prisoners from that, generally speaking, you're likely to win. Because you basically decapitated their command and control. That is where the commanders usually are, especially the Commander-in-Chief. Sure, I will admit, it may seem counterintuitive to say in a defensive war you should go on the assault, but this was still during the time of the call to the offensive, or at least when it was starting to really be formed. The Franco-Prussian Wars were really cemented it into Europe's ideas, but the Union and the Confederacy were still dealing with post-Napoleonic tactics, which still relied heavily on offense. I mean, Napoleon basically showed if you can get troops to a place quickly and attack people separately and defeat in detail, you can basically set terms for everyone. So for the United States, they're likely still thinking in this way. Same with the Confederacy. So a sudden, quick, decisive blow could well convince a lot in the Union to want to negotiate. Potentially that they could see border states turned over, negotiations commence regarding trade, and several other things. But the key is to strike hard and fast. The Union has more men. It has more industry. It has the ability to get more loans so it can buy guns even when it can't afford them naturally. That means, fundamentally, if a long-term slugging fest comes to bear, the South's less likely to win. So what it needs is to essentially knock the North out quickly. Sure, the North may hold on for a few years. That's fine. But what's important is that a quick, decisive blow is delivered, and then they can just hold the line there. Push to Kentucky if you want. Push to Missouri. Take Maryland and Delaware. Not like Delaware's going to change much. I mean, it's just changing a flag. But if you take early victories and just hold, you stand a good chance, because if the North can't organize quick enough, if it can't make sure that its command is as effective as it would like to be, well then, it can't fight the war effectively. And that was the key to the North's strategy in reality. They coordinated and they planned. The Navy blockaded all along this area. This whole area was under blockade. This Anaconda Plan, as it was called, basically set the Confederacy on a timer. If they couldn't get a quick, decisive victory against the North and force them to negotiate, they would just be starved out. And this also led to the capture of New Orleans, along with several other points along the coast. I'm just drawing points, not necessarily where the forts were seized, but it gets the point across. And with that fact, the South basically had no choice but to hope that Lincoln loses the election. Or that they get foreign recognition, I suppose, but that's unlikely, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation. A quick and decisive victory at D.C. was pretty much their only chance, or at least something similar, because fundamentally, to get what they need, either a demoralized North that isn't willing to keep fighting, or European recognition, they needed to win a decisive tactical victory on a strategically important point. Great. You defended Bull Run. Okay, congratulations. Does Europe care? No, because it's not that relevant of a place. You get to Gettysburg, and you lose. Oh, cool, you did things, but why would anyone care? You took parts of Kentucky. Okay, great. What does that mean to anyone else? I doubt someone in Philly hearing, oh, hey, the rebels got to Kentucky is really going to care that much. They're going to be like, how dare they? But that's about it. Same with Europe. I doubt a Brit even knows what Kentucky is beyond the most fine of details. Or the most broad of details, like, oh yeah, that's probably a U.S. state. They don't know much about Kentucky. But if suddenly they heard the District of Columbia fell, then Britain's going to be looking at the U.S. and thinking, what is going on over there? Maybe this Confederacy has an actual shot. And if someone from Philly or New York heard that, they're going to think, the war is over. We can't win. Better to negotiate now. And so that would give the Confederacy the leverage it would need to force a quick peace and surrender. That is how they would win in any possible scenario. They'd need a quick, decisive victory that essentially stuns the world into either acknowledging them by generating a defeatist attitude in the North, or by showing themselves to be able to threaten population centers. You take out D.C., what's the closest city, really, that's of any importance at the time? Philadelphia. Maybe Baltimore, but Philly's the main one. Then New York City. Those big population centers that really carry quite a bit of the North's industry, right in your path. And Appalachia means you're unlikely to get some people coming over from Ohio to reinforce as easily. Now, sure, there's train routes, but those are what explosives are for. And so that's my main thing when bringing this up. It wasn't a lost cause. No matter how much you want to galvanize either side, this is battle. Battle is not decided by inevitability. It is decided by strategy and the grand scale, which allows for effective tactics on the smaller scales. You win a battle to further your end strategy. If your goal is to achieve victory in an assault, you push. You strangle supplies, you ensure the enemy cannot last, and you overrun their positions. That's what the North did. The South, on the other hand, did not play to what they had, and they did not make a strategy around taking what they could and then holding the line. They instead favored bold tactics rather than practical practical strategy. They had plenty of battlefield skill for tactics, but not so much for strategy. Think about it. Was Gettysburg really the best place to target? No. Was it really the best idea to push into Pennsylvania when DC's right there? Unlikely, especially with a blockade. Indeed, the fact that the blockade even lasted and that the Confederacy didn't concentrate all ships to try to break it was a poor strategy. They let New Orleans fall, one of the richest cities in their state. They should have bled to make sure that it didn't, but they basically abandoned it. It was strategy that lost the Confederacy the war. It wasn't a lost cause. It was a cause that could be won if played well. Difficult, yes, but still possible. And the Confederacy didn't. That'll be all. Thank you for your time. Hope you enjoyed the video.